All right, let's dive right into this explainer. I want you to picture a time bomb. Not your classic Hollywood bomb made of wires and ticking explosives, but a conceptual one. A time bomb made of a single, unassuming digit that literally paralyzed a billion-dollar warship. Picture this. It's September 21st, 1997. The USS Yorktown, which is a billion-dollar U.S. Navy missile cruiser, is just cruising off the coast of Virginia. Suddenly, it shudders to a complete halt, totally dead in the water. Now, these warships are built to take a torpedo strike or survive a mine blast, but nobody, and I mean nobody, fought to defend the Yorktown against the number 0. You see, the ship's computers had just gotten some new engine control software, but hiding deep in that code was a single 0 that engineers simply forgot to take out. So when the computer system naturally tried to divide by that 0, the resulting mathematical error instantly rendered 80,000 horsepower totally and completely worthless. It actually took them hours just to hook up the emergency controls and 2 full days to get this massive ship back into fighting shape.
So, welcome to the explainer. Today, we're not just looking at 0 as some boring mathematical placeholder. We're looking at it as a dangerous, earth-shattering entity that humanity actively tried to suppress. It's this wild concept that clashes with our deepest philosophies, and as you just saw, it holds the power to completely unravel the framework of logic itself. To really grasp how this single digit threatens the very fabric of our reality, we're going to investigate its 5,000-year criminal record. We'll be hitting the billion-dollar error, life without 0, the birth of the placeholder, the mathematical menace itself, and finally, how the West literally rejected nothingness.
So, starting off with part 1, the billion-dollar error, and moving right along to part 2, life without 0. Now, it might seem kind of crazy to us today, but early humanity actually functioned perfectly well without 0 for millennia. I mean, you really don't need a math symbol to tell someone you have absolutely no bananas, right? Math didn't start with abstract equations, it started with wolves. Well, wolf bones. Over 30,000 years ago, a caveman carved 55 notches into a wolf bone, grouping them in 5s, which makes sense, probably based on the 5 fingers on his hand. And from that base 5 system, we eventually evolved to these super complex Egyptian solar calendars around 3000 BC, and later the Babylonian base 60 abacus. But the crazy thing is, nowhere in this massive early timeline did the concept of 0 actually exist. And honestly, because they didn't have it, early mathematics was incredibly clunky. Take the ancient Egyptians, for example. They had a base 10 system, but because there was no 0, they had to invent specific separate pictures for units, tens, hundreds, the whole shebang. So if an Egyptian scribe needed to jot down the number 87, they couldn't just write an 8 and a 7. No way. They had to draw out 15 separate symbols, 8 little heel bones just to say 80, and then 7 vertical marks for the 7. It was a ton of work. But contrast that with the Mayans over in the Americas, and it's a totally different story. They used a base 20 system featuring these wild, face-based glyphs. And unlike the ancient Egyptians or the Greeks, the Mayans actually figured it out. They developed a true 0. And because they had that 0, they logically seeded the very first day of their solar calendar months as day 0. Our Western calendar, which evolved from the zero-list Egyptians, completely lacks a year 0, which, by the way, is exactly why we are constantly arguing about when a new decade or millennium actually begins. Which brings us to part 3, the placeholder is born. Over in the old world, 0 wasn't born out of some grand philosophical debate. It was born out of pure, sheer necessity. It was literally just a simple accounting fix for the Babylonians. They were using an abacus-style base 60 system on clay tablets. A single wedge shape meant 1, but here's the catch. That exact same wedge could also mean 60 or even 3,600, depending entirely on which column it was in. So the number 61 and the number 3,601 looked completely identical on a tablet. To fix this absolute nightmare of a clerical issue, around 300 BC, they basically invented a double slanted wedge to show an empty column, a placeholder, just to keep the other digits in their proper lanes. But I need to be super clear about this point. At this specific time in history, 0 was merely a digit. It was not a number. It was a formatting tool. It had absolutely 0 value of its own, pun intended, and no real place on a number line. It just sat at the bottom of a column, making sure the real numbers didn't slide around. All right, part 4, the mathematical menace. So the real trouble starts when 0 wakes up and stops behaving like a neat little placeholder. To really get why 0 is so dangerous, I want you to imagine the number line as a stretchy rubber band. Multiplication is basically stretching that band.
If you multiply by 2, you stretch the rubber band out, doubling the distance between numbers. Dividing by 2 relaxes the rubber band back to its original state. And right there, that analogy perfectly captures the destruction. What actually happens when you multiply by 0? Well, the rubber band doesn't stretch and it doesn't relax. It just completely snaps. The entire framework of your mathematical number line collapses instantly into a single, inescapable point. Everything, absolutely everything, just becomes 0. But man, it gets infinitely worse. If multiplying by 0 collapses the number line, dividing by 0 completely nukes the foundation of logic. If you just casually divide by 0 in an algebraic equation, you can mathematically prove absolutely any absurdity in the universe. I'm totally serious. You can mathematically prove that 1 plus 1 equals 42. You can prove that Winston Churchill was a carrot. Once you divide by 0, logic simply ceases to exist. And that leads us to our final chapter, Part 5. The West rejects nothing. This is the real historical climax. The ancient Greeks violently rejected 0. They were terrified of it because it threatened their perfectly ordered universe. Think about guys like Pythagoras. They were completely obsessed with geometry and the golden ratio. To them, beautiful, rational, predictable proportions governed everything, from the architecture of the Parthenon to the spiral of a nautilus shell, even the literal orbits of the planets. Their core belief was all is number, and to them, numbers were physical shapes. Because their math was so incredibly visual, conceptualized as literal geometric shapes, 0 was a logical impossibility. Just ask yourself, what exactly is a square with a width of 0 and a height of 0? It's a shape with no width and no substance. To a Greek mathematician, that simply made 0 sense. So they just flat out refused to acknowledge 0 as a real number. But by burying their heads in the sand, the Greeks created this massive intellectual blind spot. It meant they literally couldn't solve Zeno's paradox. You might have heard of this. It's an agonizing puzzle where the lightning-fast warrior, Achilles, is racing a tortoise that gets a little head start. Zeno argued that Achilles can never actually catch the tortoise, because every single time Achilles reaches where the tortoise just was, the tortoise has moved a tiny bit further ahead. The remaining distance just divides infinitely into smaller and smaller and smaller fractions. Now, today, we know that an infinite sum of shrinking fractions actually has a destination. It has a limit that approaches 0. It's like if you keep cutting a penny in half forever. But because the Greeks lacked the concept of 0, they had no destination for these shrinking numbers. They couldn't see a mathematical limit. All they saw was an endless, infinite void, and that absolutely terrified them. Because ultimately, 0 and infinity are twins, right? They're two sides of the exact same coin. Accepting 0 meant you had to accept the primal void. It meant accepting chaos and accepting that before creation there was just absolute nothingness. That concept fundamentally shook Western philosophers to their core because their entire worldview relied on a cozy universe that was tightly packed with matter and divine order. So, to save his neat, finite little universe and to protect his philosophical proof of a prime mover, God, the great Aristotle took the easy way out. He simply outlawed the void. He just declared that the void and the infinite were human constructs that mathematicians didn't actually need. And just like that, with the stroke of a pen, Aristotle successfully buried the concept of 0 in the Western world for thousands of years. So, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. How is your modern worldview still shaped by a number that the ancients so desperately tried to erase from history? The next time your computer randomly crashes or a multi-billion-dollar warship goes totally dead in the water because of a tiny divide by 0 error, just remember, you are witnessing the ancient, untamed power of the void. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep exploring those incredible ideas hiding right in plain sight.